becomes quite palpable once you think about how we learn, like learning processes in education, or also how artists work and realize themselves. Think about an artist, this author writing this novel, and finding him or herself realized in the work that he or she then sort of can read again as an externalized kind of product. Or think about yourself. Here at university, you produce a student paper, as an objectivized output. And in that process of objectivizing, in a way, your intentions to write the student paper, you learn something. You read through it again, and at the end of the day, you're sort of richer in knowledge than you were at the very beginning. And this is, in a way, a one-person micro model, an idealist model of all kinds of actions, one could say, which Hegel designed to think about how individual conscience can be modeled in history. Marx basically bought into all of the assumptions behind this model, but gave it a very important twist, which is he considers this model not just as a very good model for mental activity, like thinking, or perhaps if you have various human beings in having an intellectual conversation, but he interprets this as a model for any kind of material action, or what he considers labor or work. So work in Marx's sense is not just meant as the job you need to do or the things you need to do in order to keep alive materially, but has a very broad sense of, let's say, human flourishing or any kind of activity that is part of human beings. With the important rejection then of the Hegelian idea that this is just an ideal model for mental activity. For Marx, this is the activity of the complete human being. And in the analysis of capitalism, he also highlights this particularly as a model for material activity. So really material work, like building a piece of furniture, for instance. Okay, so let's move one step further. This was just the micro model for one individual that sort of produces an output which could be just as an ideal statement, but in the Marxian reading could also be just a material product, as like the products produced in factories. So now enters also individual B into the equation here on the lower right-hand side. So think about this again in idealist terms as a conversation between A and B, with both sort of inspiring each other and in the conversation being in a way the counterpart that is necessary for the other person then to be fully realized. So examples of this could again be, think about this as the kind of learning that you have in student groups, right? When you have others that can give you feedback. You sort of make a proposition, others use this proposition to sort of build on this proposition, or they might reject it as something false. And in this process, right, you recognize through others parts of yourselves which you didn't know beforehand, for instance. And this kind of learning process is what in this ideal social ontology, so what makes up the social world, which basically produces a non-individualist kind of ontology. where others are necessary for myself to flourish as a human being. Yeah. It is important to keep in mind, again, Marx's little twist of this ideal social ontology. In this ideal social ontology, this is a relationship of statements. Yeah? Actors are not that important in that process, but it's basically statements that interact and that become new statements in a way. And Marx' twist again here is to give this a material turn in the sense that you can interpret this not as a conversation, but as a really existing collaborative process, as for instance in the division of labor. Think about this: A and B, they don't have a conversation, they jointly want to produce a material product. Yeah? And Marx thinks about this interaction now in a very similar way as an idealist would do, but in very materialist terms. The second important twist that now enters also a more sociological analysis in all of this is that Marx thinks about this constellation here not just ahistorically, but under the conditions of capitalism. So Marx thinks that this ideal model of action, yeah, that in this ideal model of action, A and B need each other to flourish together as human beings and to realize their human nature, if you want, or the Gattungswesen, as this is put in German. And under the processes of capitalism, Marx will argue, this sort of mutual recognition will be disturbed. So to understand this model of action again and this social ontology, I wanted to provide you with this longer, lengthy quote of Karl Marx that is written in his comments on James Mill, that is John Stuart Mill's father. Quote, "Let us suppose that we had carried out production as human beings. Each of us would have in two ways affirmed himself and the other person. First, in my production, I would have objectified my individuality, its specific character, and therefore enjoyed not only an individual manifestation of my life during the activity, but also when looking at the object, I would have the individual pleasure of knowing my personality to be objective, visible to the senses, and hence a power beyond all doubt. Second, in your enjoyment or use of my product, I would have the direct enjoyment both of being conscious of having satisfied a human need by my work, that is, of having objectified man's essential nature, and of having thus created an object corresponding to the need of another man's essential nature. Third, I would have been for you the mediator between you and the species, and therefore would become recognized and felt by you yourself as the completion of your own essential nature and as a necessary part of yourself, and consequently would know myself to be confirmed in your thought and your love. Fourth, in the individual expression of my life, I would have directly created your expression of your life, and therefore, in my individual activity, I would have directly confirmed and realized my true nature, my human nature, my communal nature." End of quote. So what Marx describes, again, in a nutshell here, in these 4 points, is, first of all, that there is something like a human nature that is the essence of the anthropology that everyone thrives for. Yeah? And this human nature starts with an individual production, right? So just becoming active in the world, realizing oneself, recognizing oneself in the product. Second, then this is not just a lonely kind of activity, but it involves others. Yeah? So I know that you have a need, I respond to your need, and you sort of fulfilling your need with my products is in a way giving me a kind of recognition. Then third, this happens symmetrically also on the other side of this equation, yeah, for you, for this other person. And in this process, what happens is that we learn in a way that we belong to the same kind of human nature, so that we recognize in a way the universal, let's say, ideal behind all of this. And fourth, this ideal contains not just like a lonely human nature, but human nature is intrinsically communal. So in a way, it's only possible through the collaboration and cooperation with others that we can become full human beings. Okay, this may be a purely descriptive, so social ontology. It could also be a prescriptive one. Yeah, it depends a little bit on how you understand human nature, whether this is supposed to be just a description of the way it is, or whether you consider this as being a goal. However you interpret this now, Marx uses only this basic ontology and model of action to show that something is not going very well and smoothly under conditions of capitalism. Yeah. So Marx uses this model as a background to say that if we have conditions of, first of all, private property, the division of labor, and the exchange on markets, yeah, so the perhaps most important institutions that you have under capitalism, this fourfold realization of human nature is somehow disturbed. So that first of all,